Welcome to PWGC's Environmental Echo. I'm your host, Paul Boyce, CEO and President of PWGC. Today's episode is going to be on environmental due diligence, a very interesting topic. And today we have two guests, also from PWGC. I have an environmental senior project manager. We have Tom Melia. Melia, I got that right. I should know this. Tom's been with us for 17 years and, does a great job heading up a lot of our due diligence efforts. And we also have a project manager, Michael Gaul, who's out of our city office. He's been with us for 7 years now, which surprised me. I thought it was actually a little longer than that, but time is flying. And today we're going to be discussing, as I mentioned, environmental due diligence. For those that don't know, I'm going to let these two expert gentlemen here explain exactly what that means in terms of, what it is, what we do with it, why it's important and all that fun stuff. So let's just get going right away with this stuff. If you guys wouldn't mind, Tom, Mike, let me know. Explain to me what environmental due diligence means.
So environmental due diligence, it's typically done when someone is purchasing a property. They're going to take a look at that property, make sure they're not buying themselves a nightmare. Some contaminated disaster area where they're going to have a ton of liability to clean that property up and be on the hook for all of that money for the cleanup. It starts with the Phase 1 and a Phase 2 environmental site assessment. The Phase 1, you're going to look at the history of the property, see what it was used for, see what it's used for now, and try and identify any areas, what's called a recognized environmental condition, or a REC. You're going to look for those RECs, which are indications that there may be a problem. Any RECs that you find would be investigated further in a Phase 2 environmental site assessment, or ESA.
Yeah, it just kind of serves as like one of the keystone building blocks for someone who's looking to potentially acquire a property in terms of information that they may need for their project going forward, whether that's going to kind of inform them as to the costs that they may kind of accrue to deal with, what's going on at the property, and also to sort of inform them in terms of what they may need to do in addition to whatever their planned project is, simply to make the property feasible for occupation, whether it's for residential uses, commercial uses, other things like that.
Oh, cool. So you guys have already brought up, Phase 1, Phase 2. You mind defining those a little bit for our listeners and maybe explaining what the real key differences are? Obviously, it starts with a Phase 1. When would you need a Phase 2? Can you guys elaborate a little bit on that for us?
So the phase, you're going to start with your Phase 1. You're going to do a record search. That's going to include a record search, a physical site inspection, and review of environmental databases. That's where you're going to get an inkling of whether or not there are any problems that need to be further investigated by the Phase 2. The Phase 2 is where you're going to go out and collect some samples and analyze whether or not any of those problems you identified in the Phase 1 are going to be major problems, small problems, not an issue at all. That's where you would figure that out.
So what's like the trigger? You go through that record search, the historical review, you take a look at the site, you might see some things, but what says, to the property purchaser or the owner or whoever, it's time to go to a Phase 2 here. There's evidence, or what dictates that? What triggers it? What do you guys typically see that makes you want to recommend a Phase 2?
So ideally, there's a couple of items that sort of work in conjunction to get to the point of where you're going to call something a REC. So the first off is going to be the presence of either hazardous substances or petroleum products. So that can be chemicals like solvents, that can be gasoline, diesel, whatever it is. And then on top of that, not only do you need the presence of that, but you also need basically the identified presence or potential presence of a release of that product to the subsurface. So you're talking about whether it's a tank that maybe has a leak where gasoline has gone into the ground and into the groundwater, possibly industrial activities where they just have been dumping stuff out back into some drains that then have been gone into the ground, whether it's from an on-site stormwater system, an on-site septic system. Once you identify those kind of items and put them together where you have that presence of one of those things, the hazardous substances or the petroleum products, and you have sort of the pathway for a release and the evidence that's indicating there was a release, you kind of use those to then say, okay, looks like something we need to look into. It's something we need to investigate via the sampling in the Phase 2.
So if a site has underground storage tanks, whether it's a heating oil or if it was a gas station or whatever, does that automatically mean it's going to go to a phase 2 because that, potential exists? Or do you go back and look, were there tightness tests done? Are they double-walled tanks? How do you, without putting a hole in the ground, say, you need to do a phase 2?
Yeah, that's going to depend on the tanks. Like you said, there could be tightness tests if they have, if they're double-walled tanks with a leak detection system like you would have at a gas station, and they have records showing that system is maintained and that they're properly logging their inventory and all of that, then it might not necessarily be a wreck. That's something that we could say, yeah, there's tanks. They are obviously storing petroleum in those tanks, but they're doing X, Y, and Z to keep those tanks properly maintained, and the likelihood of them leaking is pretty low. So that's not necessarily going to be a wreck.
Okay. At PWGC, we have done numerous phase 1s and phase 2. I mean, I don't want to say countless, but I've been with the firm for a long time, and every year we've done more and more of these things. So it's probably literally hundreds, if not more, that we've done of these types of projects.
I think we're well into the thousands at this
okay,
point.
Fair enough.
Tom's the one who reads most of them.
Yeah,
anyways.
he would know. But can you guys just describe the types of clients that we typically do these types of projects for? I mean, is there one group more than another, or is it just very broad-based? And, who are the typical, property purchasers that are looking to have these done?
So we have a couple different groups that we do them for. There's developers. Obviously, somebody's going to come in and redevelop a property. We have, maybe a business owner or somebody who's going to come in and maybe keep the property as is, just purchase the property, maybe a property manager or something like that, a small business who's buying a new building to occupy. Tied in with those is banks. We'll do them directly for banks sometimes. And usually if we're doing it for a bank, it's for one of those two, a developer or a property owner. And then we run into, we do some for municipalities. We have contracts with Suffolk and Nassau County to do phase 1s. And then there's some quasi-governmental agencies like the Suffolk County Landbank, the Nassau County Landbank, where it's not technically the county, but it's kind of passing through, the property's kind of passing through the county. Properties that are in tax arrears, they want to make sure that it's, see what they're getting into before they try and sell those properties and then it would be to a developer or a property owner of some sort.
And ultimately, almost anyone who's purchasing a property that's something that's beyond your standard single family or small residential should probably be doing so, especially if it's anything that has some kind of commercial or industrial history that they just don't know a lot about. They should be doing so to at least give themselves kind of the peace of mind to say, okay, I know what this property was, I know what went on here, and either I know that there's no evidence of contamination or no history of anything that would be concerning, or they say, okay, there was, but I investigated it and I either addressed it or I sort of, went down the pathway to try to remediate or identify what those problems were.
You headed me off at my next question, Michael. I was going to ask, is there a certain group or owner that we wouldn't typically do a phase 1 for? And you said, small residential, like a single family home. Some of us have bought homes, and I certainly didn't go through that process. You'd only get that engineering inspection done, but wasn't looking to do an environmental investigation at, a residential property out in suburbia there on Long Island.
Although even with those, I suppose it depends on the concerns about the history of the property. I do know just on one specific situation where, there was an area that got turned into, I believe, some kind of residential development after it had been sort of like a commercial, I don't know if it was a commercial plaza or a commercial development. And I don't know what you think about, Tom, in that situation, whether or not they might even need it just if there's some history concerns.
Usually with a single family residential, we're not doing any kind of due diligence unless it's the rare occasion would be a single family residential that has been converted to some kind of commercial use. We did one a year or two ago where it was a contractor buying, it was a single family home that had been converted to office space and apparently in the past had been used by a landscaper. So they had tanks and all kinds of fertilizers and pesticides and stuff stored on site. So he had some concerns about that and brought us in to do a phase 1 and a phase 2 for him.
It's it's just, to me, it's rarely do I see an area get rezoned from like commercial to residential, but that brings up a good point. And this sort of ties well with the brownfields podcast we did recently, where a developer comes in and they may rezone it and it may go into residential, but it's usually not single family. It's going to be more of a multifamily or an apartment type thing or mixed use or something along those lines. So that's interesting as well. But let's dive a little more into like the scoping of like a phase one. What goes into that? How do you decide what you need to look for? My limited knowledge of these things, even though the firm's done thousands of them, I've never done one. Okay, my background's in the engineering side, so I've looked at them, I've seen them, I've never prepared one. I know there are specific standards that need to be followed by I don't want to say regulatory bodies, but agencies that may develop guidelines that should be followed. Can you guys talk a little bit about when you get a type of property, is there stuff that you would automatically look for, or is there stuff that you would, you only look for if it's on a checklist type of thing, or are there standards that dictate this is what you have to look for and that's it?
So, regardless of what the site's been used for, there's the phase one process is governed by an ASTM standard. There's a very specific ASTM standard that lays out exactly.
ASTM is, do you know?
American Society for Testing and Materials.
All right, just for our listeners' sake.
So there's an ASTM standard that pretty rigidly defines what has to be done. In addition to that ASTM standards, there's the EPA's All Appropriate Inquiry Rule. The All Appropriate Inquiry Rule.
That's the AAI?
AAI.
All right, I'm learning.
So the AAI rule will provide property owners with protection. They'll qualify for innocent landowner defense under CERCLA if they do their environmental due diligence. The ASTM standard and the AAI rule kind of tie together in that, I guess the easiest way to put it is the ASTM standard is kind of a framework for how you meet the requirements of the AAI rule. So when they update the ASTM standard, EPA actually is involved with that whole process. EPA will, essentially sign off on the ASTM standard to say, yes, it meets our requirements if you follow this. And then, God forbid the worst happens and it turns out your property is a Superfund site, you'll be protected from that liability in the future. So when EPA comes in and cleans that up, they're not going to come after that property owner for, to try and recoup those costs. So the ASTM standard that defines, exactly what is in the phase one. There's a couple different parts that we talked about a little bit. There's a site inspection. There's review of environmental databases, review of historical imagery like sandborne fire insurance maps, aerial photos, topographic maps, and what's the other one?
City directories?
City directories, thank you. Historical phone books.
So it sounds like a lot of that stuff has overlaps in case there's a gap in one, it may be picked up in another. Like, we don't have sandborne maps for this area.
Right. Yeah, which is the problem on Long Island a lot, except for some of the small, downtown village type areas that have been there forever. We typically don't have a lot of sandborne maps for Long Island. In the city, they tend to be a lot more useful. We have them going back to the 1800s.
Back in the horse and buggy days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see stuff like that on them. Horse garage, stables.
So when you do this preliminary site inspection, right? It's we're not going out, we're not taking any samples, we're not probing into the earth, we're not, what do you guys do? I mean, it's non-destructive. What are the limits of that site inspection? What are you looking for? What are you capable of doing? What are you supposed to do?
So again, you really are looking for, at the end of the day, evidence of items related to those hazardous substances and petroleum products. So you're looking for a whole wide range of things. The most commonplace things you're looking for are going to be tanks, chemical storage, sometimes transformers, other types of possibly PCB-containing equipment, such as hydraulic elevators, things like that. But on top of that, you're also going to be looking for sort of like supplemental evidence, whether that's like stained soils, stressed vegetation. You're also going to look for possible discharge pathways, like things like floor drains, storm drains. And you're going to kind of take all of those things together to make a bigger picture of sort of not only possibly what's going on at that time, but sometimes you can use the items that you see there to help determine what went on in the past. And on top of that, you're also talking to hopefully either a site representative, whether it's the owner, the site manager, maybe the tenant, to also talk about what kind of went on there, maybe what went on there before them, so that you can use all of those pieces of information kind of in conjunction to help determine whether or not you actually think there's something that's going to be a risk at the property.
And so, like, for guys like you that have done this for a while, you've done a lot of them, what kind of training or experience, how do you guys become, knowledgeable about this stuff? Is it just on-the-job training, or is there, instruction courses, or how do you guys become these site inspection experts? What do we do for our staff to get them up to speed?
So, there is a training course through ASTM that we typically, the people that do a lot of these inspections and also a lot of these reports will take that course. But at the end of the day, that course is only a multi-day sort of classroom course that's showing you examples. In terms of actually becoming sort of very knowledgeable about the inspections, you really do have to do, I think, a good amount of site visits. You have to see a lot of different properties, because sometimes maybe someone even knows a lot about maybe certain types of commercial properties or multifamily residential properties, but they may not know a lot about like industrial properties. I know I had to see some mine sites for the first time, and that took me a little while to sort of get my mind up to speed in terms of what I was looking for, items that might be concerns and things like that. But it's sort of just getting the proper training, whether it's with other people, and also taking a ton of notes and a ton of photos so that you can also relay them to other people at the firm and get their opinion if there's something that you don't know right away what it is.
Because Mike, you brought up a great point. There's a lot of different types of sites out there, from commercial, industrial, municipal, whatever. And each one is going to have a whole slew of different and unique conditions that may lead to a wreck, right? So how do you make sure you saw them all? Is there a chance we could not see something when we do an inspection or a record search? What happens if we miss something?
As far as the site inspection goes, we have a checklist that our field inspectors will bring out with them to go through. That's a list of everything that they should be looking for. So we typically are pretty good at that, about not missing stuff. What I tell our staff that's doing the inspections is, if you see something you're not sure, take a picture. FaceTime me, show it to me on FaceTime. I'll take a look at it. I think that's the easiest way. With the technology we have these days, it's not like it's not like 20 years ago where you had to take a picture and get the film developed and then come back and
Yep.
scan the picture. It's a lot easier these days if somebody sees something they're not sure about in the field, to figure out what it is on the fly.
Speaking of technology, have you guys used drones or anything to do any of these site inspections, or is it just boots on the ground and you're walking around, nosing around, lifting manhole covers, that sort of thing?
I can think of one site that we used a drone on, and that was strictly because it was a site we didn't have access to. Our client was looking at a property they wanted to buy. They wanted to get started on their due diligence, but hadn't spoken to the person selling the property yet. So we were kind of doing it on the sly.
So drive-by drone inspection, huh?
Basically, yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
It was the site was in the Bronx. There was a park right across the river in Manhattan. One of our drone guys parked at the park, flew the drone across the river, flew it over the site, got some pictures, and we did that. Eventually, we were able to get, once the deal moved forward, we were able to get access to the site and do a proper site inspection, and that site's ongoing now.
Wow.
So yeah, it's you can do it. There's a new ASTM standard coming out next year that's going to have some specific provisions for when you can use drones or remote imagery for site inspections, when it's appropriate, when it's not. But we'll have to see what they come up with. That's not finalized yet.
Okay.
And it may be most beneficial, honestly, for sort of large properties. If there's big properties where maybe it's going to take a lot to see the entire thing because it's forested, because it's in a rural area, because it's who knows what, then maybe that's going to be something where it can kind of factor in to make our lives easier, and also to give you sort of a different vantage point of what the property is like, rather than obviously being at the ground level. And would it help if we do thermal imaging, and there's all sorts of other options you can do with a drone, or is that not really relevant at the phase 1 level? I'm not so sure, but I mean, obviously, we're always trying to kind of think of new ways to integrate different technology and sort of to update how we do inspections. So it's something we certainly could consider. I can't think of anything specific off the top of my head.
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay.
But,
Okay. Well, this is.
I think that would be kind of a one-shot thing if something came up. Hey, that might work on this. But
this has helped me segue more into what I'm a little more. I've had more exposure to over my career. I've done some phase twos. I've been part of them. All right. I've been behind a drill rig, punching our drill rig or a geoprobe, collecting soil and groundwater samples and endpoint samples after something may have been dug up and removed. What goes into the scoping of a phase two? Obviously it's going to come out of the phase one, what you guys found, but take me to the next step here.
So again, the phase twos are also governed by an ASTM standard. There's a phase two ASTM standard, and it's less defined than the phase one standard, just because it's a much more wide variety of what you may or may not be doing. But the gist of that standard is, what are the questions that need to be answered about the site, and how are you going to answer them? So you have to look at any of those recs that you identified in the phase one, be that a tank or a vapor intrusion issue or whatever. What's going to be the most appropriate way to evaluate that issue and basically identify whether or not it's going to be a problem going forward, or if it's something that's okay, there's a tank, but the tank didn't leak, it's fine, you don't need to worry about it, or is it leaking petroleum into the groundwater, and now you have a major costly issue that you have to deal with. So that's the key, is really how are we going to best evaluate those issues for what our client wants to do. When we look at these issues, we want to look at what our client is doing with the property going forward before we make a decision of how we're going to scope that out. If they're going to use the property as is, maybe we need to be a little bit more restrictive or a little bit more conservative in how we look at things. If it's a property that they're going to redevelop, maybe we don't need to, because if there is a problem, it's something that they can just easily address during construction. So it's we have to kind of balance that between what's a problem and how easy it is to address.
So when you start doing the phase two, and let's say you find something, right? So I've got some contamination in the soil. Does that lead you to go further? Do we have to go and explore with additional sampling points, or now do I have to go down to groundwater, or then do I determine there's a soil or a soil vapor intrusion issue in a building, and then what do I do?
That's going to be a case-by-case issue. Again, It's going to depend on the client. Some clients, if you find an issue, even a minor issue, that's it. They don't want anything to do with it. Okay, I'm out. I'm going to move on to the next property, find something that's clean. Other clients who, I don't want to say savvy, that's not the right word, maybe just with a little bit more experience dealing with environmental issues, they're not going to be scared off by something that's if it's something that we can classify as quote-unquote minor, they're going to be more willing to take that on.
But does our scope often expand once we start poking around, or does it? We're usually like, okay, we're going to go sample here, and that's it. Or if we find something, does it? Okay, now we have to do some maybe step outs. You want to delineate?
So
does that ever happen?
We have had cases where that's happened. I mean, I can think of certain situations where maybe there's something like an auto repair garage or something like that, and we put in our initial sort of set of borings or vapor points, and then maybe we do find evidence of some kind of contamination that we want to sort of get a rough idea of the scope of that contamination, depending on the amount of time we have, depending on sort of how we scoped out our phase two. There are times where we can sort of build that in to get a better idea if there's something that we're sort of anticipating, but it is a very case-by-case basis. And again, the other key thing is sort of like Tom was saying, is that you're doing, ultimately at the end of the day, you're doing this phase one and phase two a lot of times for buyers under sort of their due diligence phase, where there's their X amount of days or months when they're trying to determine whether or not they for sure want to buy the property and want to buy it at the property that potentially they agreed upon. So they're going to use that information to then decide, okay, I want to go forward with this, or maybe no, I want to renegotiate with the seller because we found something that I wasn't anticipating, or no, I want to completely back out because I don't want to deal with this spill, or I don't want to deal with whatever it is that we find.
Tied into that also is a lot of times they'll have in their contract that the seller is responsible for a certain amount of remediation, a certain dollar figure. If there's problems up to, X amount of dollars, it's on the seller. Anything beyond that is on the buyer. So they're going to want us to try and quantify as best as possible with that phase 2 data, how much, what's the price tag on this remediation. So that's, in that, in a situation like that, then yes, it might expand. If we do find some contaminated soil, maybe we're going to do some step out borings. Maybe we'll do some additional extra groundwater samples, something along those lines. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, guys. Well, that certainly helps. Certainly me, and I'm sure our listeners understand the phase 1 and phase 2, the components involved in them, and how you evolve from one to the other. Michael, tell me a little bit about the difference between doing this type of work in New York City versus Long Island. Where do you see some key differences?
Sure. So I mean, in terms of honestly any region by region, case by case basis, there are always going to be differences simply because there's different types of environmental issues region by region. There also are different types of sort of environmentally sensitive or environmentally important sites, on a case by case basis, regardless of what region you're in. But specifically in terms of New York City, one of the key things that we see a lot are E-designation sites, which are essentially sites where a zoning designation was placed on a property because of the history of the property, whether it's because the property was a gas station, the property may have had tanks, etc. And then they apply this to the property typically through the rezoning process when a neighborhood gets rezoned. And then what that does is whoever is going to basically buy that property or work on that property, they need to comply with this fixed set of rules, right? So that's one thing that we see a lot in New York City. Another thing we also see a lot is going to be historic fill, simply because so many of these properties have been redeveloped at least one time, possibly multiple times. And if you're talking about doing that back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, who knows where the fill came from that they use at this property. They might have backfilled it with something from an industrial site. Sometimes we've seen slag. We've seen all kinds of things. So again, a lot of times in the city, we do try to factor in that could be a concern. And there's other sort of more situationally specific issues. Maybe we're working in a neighborhood that we have sort of pre-existing knowledge about, whether it's somewhere like Williamsburg that had a long, and storied sort of industrial past, where maybe we know something about the neighboring property, or we know something about a nearby property. And so then we can sort of work that also into the phase 1 to sort of say, hey, maybe this property doesn't look so bad from the sort of the immediate view, but knowing what we know about your neighbors or other people on your street, maybe you want to look into it at least a little bit before you go into the property and buy this property, so that at least you know what your site's actually like in the subsurface.
Wow. And what about, like some other, to me, in my mind, right, Long Island versus the city. The city, probably 99% sewered, maybe higher, right? Some places out on Long Island don't have a lot of sewering.
Right.
Does that factor into any of this too?
So it definitely does in terms of Long Island. I do know that Tom is definitely going to know more about in terms of how it factors in. I mean, obviously it creates sort of a discharge pathway, but I don't know if Tom wants to sort of...
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at Suffolk County, I think it's something like 80% of Suffolk County, 90% of Suffolk County doesn't have sewers. So any kind of industrial property out there where there's no sewer, they're going to have an on-site sanitary system. Even if it's something relatively that you wouldn't even think of as being an issue, like a restaurant, they're using commercial grade degreasers and disinfectants in the kitchen. Yeah. All of that's getting washed down the drain into the sanitary system, and we have the Suffolk County Department of Health Services out in Suffolk County that regulates these, and they have, a set of standards that if there's contamination over, whatever their levels are in those drains, those have to be, those are considered contaminated and have to be cleaned out. And it's a very, very widespread problem in Suffolk County. Basically every property in Suffolk County has one, and it's very easy for them to be contaminated.
And we know that well. We've tied this ties into some of our other podcasts. We talked about sewers and sanitary systems, and we didn't go into a whole lot other than sanitary waste going down these drains. But you brought up a good point about industrial properties or commercial properties, maybe cooking. They may have processes. A lot of these places may even have their own sewage treatment plants to deal with this stuff before it discharges. But you never know, right? So then let's talk about some fun stuff here, some examples of potential issues you guys have, in your storied careers here at PW Grosser. What have you come across that was memorable when you were doing either a phase 1 or a phase 2 that you identified that may have really helped a potential buyer or client out in this transaction, and that they said either, thank God you told me about this, or now I know what to do, or what comes to mind as something that was real memorable to you guys? Tom, why don't you start us off?
So just recently, this was just a couple months ago, we did one for a client out east. It was a wooded parcel. They weren't really concerned about anything at all woods. We went ahead and did the phase 1. We found out that, back 30, 40, 50 years ago, whatever, a big chunk of it was a farm that had been allowed to go fallow. Trees had regrown on it. You would never know looking at it that it had been a farm. So we found that in the phase 1. We did a phase 2 for them. We found some. It was fortunate that there was nothing major. But with the farm, you get a lot of pesticides and metals in the soil.
Oh, sure. Fertilizers, yeah.
Right. Back 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of the pesticides and herbicides and whatever were metals-based compounds. And those metals, when they get in the soil, they just don't go anywhere. So, we did some surface sampling for them. We did find pesticides and metals in the soil. Fortunately, it was all low level enough that it wasn't going to affect them during construction. So they lucked out with that. They wound up walking away from the property for unrelated reasons, but that was one that would have been very, very easy to miss without doing the phase 1.
Oh, wow. Any tank horror stories that you came across, you weren't expecting? You walk out there, and I'm not saying it's a fuel tank farm, but was there anything subsurface that was unbeknownst until you got out there, or you did your record search, really unexpected?
Usually the record search is pretty good about turning up tanks. Between the Sanborns and the databases, we run into problems with tanks sometimes in Suffolk County because the tank program, DEC normally regulates underground storage tanks, as you know. The tank program has been delegated to the Department of Health in Suffolk County and Nassau County. So their record keeping is not always as good. So a lot of times it'll say there's tanks, it'll say tanks are removed, and that doesn't really match up with reality.
Mm-hmm. So
that's usually if we're having a problem with tanks, it has something to do with that, where it says they're removed and we go out there and we find a fill port still there, and lo and behold, we do the phase 2. Hey, that tank's still there. We just had that problem on a site out in East Hampton where they were 100% sure that there were no tanks. We had to do a phase 2 anyway for other reasons. We had a ground penetrating radar survey done, just for unrelated reasons. We were like, let's just look at where the tanks were supposed to be, just in case. Lo and behold, there's one of the tanks is still there.
Uh-huh.
They were no. Those tanks were all definitely removed. Okay, all right. Well, we're here. Let's just take a look. Oh, this one's still here.
What about personally? I told you guys in the early part of my career, I was back out behind a drill rig or a geoprobe, and there were times we were doing phase 2. We'd go down, not expecting to find anything, and all of a sudden I'll pull up the sand, right, unsaturated sand, soil, and it would just stink of gasoline. Have you guys ever had to call in a spill or anything when you were doing this type of work?
Yeah, all the time. It happens.
I've had to do it.
We're very clear with the clients about that. That if there's petroleum, we have to call in a spill. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that in New York.
Yep.
We also definitely have sites where we'll know there's a tank there. We'll look at the records, and it might say that the tank was abandoned, but then there's not necessarily a lot of information about how it was abandoned. And we'll go in, and we'll maybe still say to take a look at it because it was abandoned, a long time ago. We'll do some borings in the vicinity of the tank, and either we'll come up with evidence that there was a spill, or we'll come up with evidence that maybe the tank was not as well abandoned as maybe it said. So sometimes that can be another thing that shows up.
That's a good point. Actually, we run into that also with tanks that were removed. Just because they were removed doesn't necessarily mean they were removed properly. They can just pull them and that's it. They don't bother assessing whether or not there was any contamination. So a lot of times, even if the tanks have been removed, when we're doing our due diligence, even if the tank has been removed, we're going to want to see some kind of documentation showing that A, it was removed properly, they took some samples to make sure that the soils underneath were clean and that everything was disposed of properly.
Good. Michael, you have any memorable projects that really stand out from the phase 1 or phase 2 investigation that wow, look what we just found, or this was a surprise?
Well, I definitely think, just tying back into the city-specific stuff, I do think a lot of times we get sites that are E-designation sites in the city that maybe the developer is going to buy it and they see that and they call us and they go, why is this here? Like, we don't think anything's wrong with the property. There are even E-designation sites that are just vacant properties that maybe have just sat vacant for a long period of time. The developer goes to buy it, they see that, they call us, and what they don't realize is that if you're in that E-designation program, especially for specifically hazardous materials, you're talking about not just doing that initial preliminary investigation of the site to figure out what's there. You're talking about doing a sort of a long remedial action process where we're out there every single day, soils being touched, soils being excavated, soils being moved around. And maybe they didn't factor that into their initial pricing for their project. So a lot of times people come to us and are very thankful in terms of just us explaining that process on the front end, either before they're going to buy the property or right away when they're kind of starting to plan out what they're going to do with it. Because if we don't tell them about it and we don't kind of go into depth about how the process works, then that's going to be something that's completely left out of their budget and sort of a line item that's completely forgotten. So that happens a lot in the city.
Wow. So, all right. So along the lines of providing examples, what do we do as PWGC that, we go above and beyond to fulfill the client's needs in terms of environmental due diligence? Tom, what's something that we, as a firm, that you generally, are either asked to do or we strive to do to really exceed expectations?
I think the key is we work with the client based on what their needs are going to be right from the get-go. Like I said earlier, depending on what they're going to do, if it's just a redevelopment project, if it's a purchase as is, if we're working for a bank, they're all going to have slightly different requirements. We'll meet their turnaround time requirements if they need if they need a phase 1 in 7 days, if they let their due diligence period get almost to the end before they get started and they need a phase 1 in 7 days, we'll do a phase 1 in 7 days. We'll bend over backwards to meet their requirements.
It's definitely most commonly just comes down to flexibility. I mean, we had one client that came to us fairly recently and basically said, I'm looking to buy an entire property assemblage from another real estate company. It ended up being like 10 properties, and their due diligence period was going to be over in about, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks. And they basically were like, here you go. Let's see if you can figure out, how to get this done in time. And luckily, because we have sort of a good mix of different people who can work on it, we can spread out the work and we can get things done as soon as possible. We also have a lot of cases where maybe there's a client we've worked with a lot in Long Island or New York City, and they say, hey, we're going to buy property somewhere else, but we kind of trust you guys so much, or we're so used to working with you guys, that we'll send you guys over there to kind of do the phase 1 in that area. We trust you to sort of do the proper research to learn about that area, get more regional specific knowledge, and they'll send us out there to do it. I know, like for me specifically, I had one phase 1 where I basically went up in the morning up to Boston, did the phase 1 inspection for about an hour, took the train straight back, and basically wrote the report, most of it on the train going there and back. But it was just somebody who was just used to working with us, and they figured this is, it's easier than
These are my guys.
Find someone there, stuff like that. So that's why I know we've probably done phase 1s in at least 4 or 5 different states around the area.
New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts.
Trying to think if there's a 5th one.
Virginia.
Rhode Island, I think we had to do recently.
Rhode Island. Yeah. We did just do one in Rhode Island. We've done them in Virginia in the past. Maryland. I mean, there's probably other ones that I'm forgetting.
I'm sure.
But all up, we're not just tri-state area.
Sounds like we just did a podcast on geothermal stuff. It's very coincident with the same geographic region we're doing geothermal systems, sort of the Northeast, spreading out a little bit, and geothermal went out to the Midwest and a little beyond, but very similar. Interesting. So guys, I'm sold on the importance of the phase 1, phase 2, and I hope our listeners are, right? What happens if you don't do one? What could be the result of not doing your due diligence? What kind of horror stories have you guys heard or seen? What possibly could go wrong if you don't undertake your due diligence before you go in and buy, a commercial, industrial, or mixed use type of property?
So, I mean, I have one specific example that wasn't even necessarily that they didn't do the phase 1. It was just simply that sort of an improper phase one was done on the front end, where it was someone who called us basically and said, hey, I've had this property for a number of years. I had a phase one done up front, but now I have the EPA reaching out to me and saying that the site used to be a lead smelting facility and telling me that I basically have to do a removal assessment and I have to figure out what I'm going to do with this property. Now, meanwhile, this site, when you go out there, they're just using it for parking. It was just something that they bought that they thought was a cheap piece of property that was in their area across the street from their workshop. And they just bought it to do parking on it. And now they've come to find out, when we did the sampling for them, it's got about 8 feet of hazardous lead soils, just all, basically from the waste that was from this smelting facility. It's got, slag in the soil. It's got sort of all kinds of discoloration. And the reality was that if maybe there had been a little bit more research done on the front end, probably what would have happened is that at the very least they wouldn't have bought it, or they would have at least been better protected and had more knowledge about what they were buying into.
You could really be left holding the bag if you don't, it sounds like. I mean, that's just astounding and frightening.
Especially because the smelting facility, the company, was gone. So the EPA has almost no one else to target in terms of who's going to do this work for us other than the people who now own the property.
Oh, geez.
So it was a bit of an issue that then we got brought in to sort of help them try to address.
Tom, you have anything you want to share on that topic?
The quorum site. So this was a client we had. They had a phase one done by someone else. It was a strip mall. I forget if they had missed that there was one of the units in the strip mall had previously been a dry cleaner. It was a thrift store at the time. It had previously been a dry cleaner. I forget if the phase one missed the dry cleaner or if they just ignored it because it wasn't a dry cleaner anymore. But we came in, we did a phase two. There was some tanks. The client brought us in. There were some tanks that needed to be assessed as part of the phase two. We did that phase two. We found perk in the soil, and fortunately, not too much in the groundwater. A little bit in the groundwater, but it was more a soil issue. So we were able to, we came in, we pulled the tank. We wound up having to bring DEC in and, clean up that perk contaminated soil. We were fortunate enough that DEC was willing to work with us, and through some negotiation, they didn't have to go through the hazardous waste program or anything. DEC let us manage it as under the spills program, which is a little bit more friendly, a little bit more user friendly.
Yep.
A little bit cheaper. But that was all. That entire problem could have been avoided if the phase one had been done properly from the get-go. If they had not missed or ignored the dry cleaner, they would have known about that in advance and saved themselves a bunch of time and money.
Again, wow.
It can be a little bit scary.
It like I said, frightening and astounding when you hear these, what could possibly happen, what could possibly be wrong, right? So, as the industry evolves or more regulations coming out or the standards changing, what are we doing to adapt and refine on how we do due diligence to best serve our clients at PWGC?
So I think I mentioned earlier there's a new ASTM standard coming out next year.
You did, yeah.
From what I've heard so far, I've been to a couple seminar kind of things about that new standard. From what it sounds like, there's not going to be any kind of dramatic changes. As there will be some stuff about using drones for site inspections, more of an emphasis on providing pictures, providing a good photo log, I think was one of the things that they mentioned. And there's probably going to be some stuff about emerging contaminants in there. As we know, PFAS is a big issue right now.
Especially on Long Island, for sure.
Yes. And technically, when we say we're doing the phase one, the definition of the REC in the ASTM standard is hazardous substance or petroleum product. And that hazardous substance is defined by EPA. Technically, PFAS isn't on that list yet. So technically, PFAS can't be a REC. But we know it's an issue.
Yeah.
So that's something we're trying to work with clients to educate them when we do the phase ones. If it's a site that could or is likely to have had some PFAS usage in the past, it's something we definitely want to bring to their attention because New York State is definitely starting to regulate that more now. They have guidance documents on how it has to be investigated and remediated, et cetera. But again, it's technically it doesn't meet the requirement of a rec.
Exactly. And, on top of that, also, obviously, specifically thinking about Long Island, sort of the coastal waterways and a lot of the coastal properties have been changing a lot, whether it's from sea level rise, the impact from storms and things like that. So that's another thing that sometimes we'll be cognizant of, that we might include a little bit of information about in our phase one. If someone maybe is looking at purchasing a property that's on a wetland, or maybe that has a wetland in the part of the property, or they're sitting on the coast, we might kind of point out to them to say like, hey, if you're going to buy this property, depending on what you're planning to do, you might need to get some permitting. You might need to sort of go through the process to possibly better shore up your coast, depending on
resiliency, huh?
Exactly. So that's another thing that we sort of try to integrate, especially as it becomes more and more important, sort of, in today's climate, and especially in the areas of Long Island, New York City.
Wow. I mean, you guys, this has been very informative. I have, personally, what I don't know about phase ones, phase twos, right? I know the environmental component, like the soil vapor, groundwater, soil itself. Do we ever get involved with like lead-based paint, asbestos, mold, moisture issues, or is that completely separate from phase one, phase two type stuff?
We include that in our phase one. Very kind of, I don't want to say superficial, but we'll assess it, but it's not. What we do as part of the phase one doesn't necessarily meet the requirements of like a real ASTM survey. We'll give you an indication of whether or not we see something that's likely to be asbestos. A asbestos survey is obviously much more thorough than what we're doing as inspection we're doing as part of the phase one. But we'll keep our eyes peeled for stuff like that, lead-based paint, mold.
Is that specifically in the ASTM standards to look for that or to mention it?
It's actually considered a non-scope consideration in the ASTM standard. So, they say you should look for it, but you don't have to still meet the AAI requirements. But that's a service we provide.
Okay. Interesting. And probably my last question for you guys, it's been quite a year with the pandemic, this past year. How have you guys seen that affect, the phase one, phase two industry or business line? Has it slowed down? Is it picking back up? What's, obviously there was a lockdown for a while. Things were put on hold. Did it affect property transactions?
Definitely. During the height of the pandemic, there was basically nobody was doing any kind of property transactions, so there weren't very many phase ones or phase twos being done. The handful that we did do, some of I'm thinking specifically of a couple of the banks that we work for. They had modified site inspection requirements because of the pandemic, where it was you would just do an exterior inspection. They didn't want anybody going inside the buildings, congregating together where they might be exposed to COVID. Over the last few months, we have seen the exact opposite of that, where these phase ones are coming in almost faster than we can turn them out.
That's a good sign.
Yes,
it really is.
Yeah, can't complain about that.
No,
I'd much rather be busy than not busy.
I'd like to see the economy growing, people at work, people at least thinking about doing stuff here. It's very encouraging.
Yeah, it seems like interest rates dropped and everybody's refinancing. Everybody's jumping on. I guess there's a lot of good deals in the city to be had right now.
Oh, yes, I know. I have not been in the city, Michael, since February of 2020. This podcast is we're cutting this in May of 2021. What have you seen in the city with those types of, deals going on?
So again, it's a lot of it was sort of the same as what Tom was saying, where the site inspections, you're kind of taking a lot more precautions in terms of what you're doing. You're wearing a mask, you're trying to be socially distant. But on top of that, in terms of the actual markets, things definitely did slow down, certainly at the height of COVID. But now what we've started to see is that some of the different developers are starting to buy either it's sort of like distressed assets or it's properties where maybe someone was planning on doing a project that then they kind of couldn't go forward with because of COVID. And so now maybe one of our clients or different developers are looking to purchase those properties, kind of bring them on and complete those projects either as scoped or maybe with slight modifications to sort of meet what they want. But it certainly has picked up quite a bit, I would say, in the city, especially in areas sort of like Brooklyn, Bronx, places that were recently rezoned.
Again, that is so encouraging to hear, really. Guys, I do want to thank you for your time today. I mean, if you guys have any closing thoughts or comments that you want to stress, I mean, this has been fully educational for me. As I mentioned, most of my career has been in the engineering side of things. but I have dabbled with the phase 2s, and I have read a phase 1 or 2 in my past. But to learn how it evolves, what goes into it, the importance of it, it was really good to hear from you guys.
Just keep, bringing us projects, and people keep buying stuff, and we'll keep doing the phase 1s and phase 2s.
Well, I can't ask for more than that. Guys, you did a great job. Keep up the good work. Again, today our guests were Tom Melia, our senior project manager of 17 years, and we have a project manager, Michael Gaul, out of our New York City office with 7 years at PWGC. I want to thank our guests, and I just want to remind our listeners, if there's any further interest in this topic or you want to hear this podcast again, you can always find us at pwgrosser.com/podcast. Feel free to reach out to us either through that venue or any type of our social media outlets. And I am Paul Boyce, CEO and President of PWGC, and this is the Environmental Echo.